So today we want to talk about scope creep in the era of AI assisted development and vibe coding. As you probably know, it's never been easier to write a couple prompts and get an application that looks real and feels incredibly easy to build. But the reality is very easy to get a false sense that it's a lot further than you think it is, and then also to continue to add features and have a grand vision to the point that you never actually complete the project. So we want to cover that today. We have Tim, who is not a developer, has never had a job as a developer, but has been successful in getting projects up and running. He's had plenty of failures, which I think is the reason that he's also had some successes. And myself, I have been a developer for over 20 years and also many side projects, startups, etc. So we want to just discuss, what project creep or scope creep could mean to the folks in the era of AI development and how maybe you can approach it to avoid some of those pitfalls. So very quickly, what is scope creep? What is project creep? It's basically the idea that as you build the project, you just continue to add more ambitious features because you feel like it's necessary for the app. And so you start to expand the scope of your application. And that's really where it all starts to go downhill. So, Tim, maybe you can speak from your personal experiences with Project Creep because we obviously discuss this often.
Yeah, I think coming from a, like you said, non-dev framework, the biggest problem I've had is while I'm doing things and I'm vibe coding with the LLM, I'll just have a thought and I'm like, dude, that would be a great idea to add. Let's just do it. And then you just start throwing it in there. I think recently, after failures and going through this process now quite a few times, I've found that it's better just to go ahead and make a note of whatever thought I had, just stick with what I'm doing, make a note of the idea that I had, and then later on see if that actually ends up fitting, seeing if it's necessary. Because a lot of times I found I go back and I'm like, I didn't even need that. Like something else solved that in what I was already building. So I think for me that's been super helpful is just brain dump your stuff and make sure you keep note of it because you can have brilliant ideas, but hold off, focus on the core problem you're trying to solve. And then from there, you can, once you kind of have that figured out and you've got a good core, then it's like, okay, now let's start adding special features or these other things that I want to do. So I think for me, that's been my biggest thing. Cause like you said, when I first started, I was just like, throw everything at it. The LLM's smart. It can figure it out. But you run into context issues. You run into, you add that new feature, it breaks a feature that you hadn't even finished yet. And now you've got a huge mess to figure out. And when you're vibe coding and coming from a background like me, you may not be able to get out of that mess. So it's almost like a start over. And that's painful too. That's kind of been my experience so far.
In the era of AI development, this has really changed how people approach things. So it's so easy to get a beautiful landing page up and running, and people will build that and they'll say, "Oh, I'm going to have this feature and that feature," and that almost becomes their roadmap because they were able to build a landing page that sold the product or the vision they had. Or they'll use fake data, not realizing that the data may actually be the core problem that they need to solve or might not be able to solve. And even if they can't get the data, it may be a case of the data is messy. It's not structured. So they have to think very carefully about how they build the app. So the ability to focus on the core problem is really important. So take, for example, let's say we're building a podcasting app, right? And the vision is to be the Riverside vision, where you can have two people record more than two people, and then it records locally, and then it kind of stitches it all together after the fact. Incredible product, but it'd be very easy to go in there and say, I have all these ideas for features to, do transcription. But the reality is you have to solve the core problem first, which is how do you even connect two people in a live stream and then record locally so that then you can stitch it back together. If you can't solve that problem, then transcription probably isn't going to matter anyway, right? So you have to make sure you solve the problems in the order of which um, are going to make or break your product. Because there's sometimes that you're just not going to be able to overcome it because either the technology's there, because there's barriers around, speed or security or just data availability. Once you solve the core problem, you can continue to build upon that.
Yeah, what do you think are some practical ways to kind of make sure that you don't run into this problem? I know I've seen people talk about like the planning part of things first and kind of really trying to figure out what your plan. And I know for me personally, that's been super helpful. I'll kind of plan out everything, but then I'll look at it and be like, number one, what does an MVP look like? And then within the MVP, what is that core function that I've got to figure out first? Do you think that's kind of the best way to tackle it? What are some things you do?
I mean, I think it depends on who you are in terms of your experience and your technical capability. But I see a lot of people that they'll do planning, for example, in Claude or Grok or OpenAI. They say, "Oh, help me put together a project brief and help me choose a framework, etc." And it'll build a nice plan for you. And then you might say, "Oh, and then we'll do phase one and go down the phases." But again, if you take that approach, the problem is you're introducing all these dependencies from day one. So I personally don't like that approach. I prefer the approach of solve just the core problems first, right? As small subsets of problems, knowing that you're going to throw it away. So you'll build the, hey, how do I record, two streams, two people connecting and then two streams recorded locally just to solve that problem because you're going to run into issues that you have to solve in that process and you're going to learn a lot. So just refine that and then you take what you've learned there, have the LLM create documentation that says, hey, here's the approach I took, here's the tools I used, put that to the side, then solve the next big problem, right? In any application might have one, two, three sort of big core problems that you want to solve. And then once you have those, now you go to your big project, brief, the whole planning stuff, where you have authentication and database and all the other stuff that you're gonna need, but that aren't sort of differentials in your application. Authentication isn't going to make or break your application, and people have solved that 1,000 times. There's plenty of providers, so you don't have to reinvent that wheel. So does it make sense, in my opinion, to tackle that from the beginning? It makes sense to tackle the hard technical pieces, the user experience pieces, the things like they might not be hard technically, but you want to iterate because you want the experience to be 10 times better than what exists before it. So tackle those problems in isolation first, create almost like a component brief just describing how you solved it. And then once you've solved those pieces, then say, okay, now I'm going to build my main project. And you have a whole plan and you're more careful with that. You're making sure you're using GitHub to save checkpoints in your application. When you're doing, the individual component parts, especially if you're not a developer, maybe you're not using GitHub because it's another thing you have to remember to do. And if you mess it up, so what? You start over. But once you get to the main application, you want to make sure you're frequently checking in, especially when you hit success and something works. Check in, and then that way, if you do have a failure, you can go back.
Yeah, I think for me the thing I always worry about is it's like, okay, if I'm building that core component, right? And let's say I get that all flushed out and if I don't have like the broad scope of what I'm trying to do, I'm worried that like, all right, I built this in, let's just say like Python, and then the next component I built in this thing, and those two things just don't work together. So I guess for me, I'm like, I feel like getting the whole picture figured out and then, within those taking out the chunks that I feel like are the most important, but at least knowing like, okay, this is the framework where everything can all work together. Do you think that's important? Or do you think it's at the end of the day, you can figure those things out later? Again, I'm going through kind of the things that go through my mind since I'm new and trying to figure these things out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, that's something I maybe think about as often because again, I am an experienced developer, so it's almost like an unconscious thing that I'm doing. Like, oh yeah, I'll know how to stitch this all together at the end.
Right.
But if you know the environment you're going to be in, maybe when you're building a component part, you're saying, hey, this needs to be a web application. This needs to be accessible on the web. If you know you're going to be deploying it on like, I guess if it's like Unlovable or Bolt, there's already constraints there that there's if you're building on Bolt, then pretty much everything you build in there is going to be compatible with each other. It's more like if you are using Cursor or Windsurf to do local development and you do your backend in Python and then your front end in React, those can't work together. No problem. The problem is the LLM may not be trained as well to stitch those together as it is with a React front end and a Node backend, right? So part of it is how good does the LLM perform to stitch technologies together that aren't maybe stitched together as often. So yeah, that is a good consideration. So if you have at least a framework in mind, that would help. But a lot of it depends on your specific project. What are you building? For most people, I think just sticking to popular technologies is probably the way to go. But there are choices there. I know for many people they don't even know, so they let the LLM decide, which again will work. So choosing a technology that is popular means that there'll be more developers that can potentially help you out. If you choose something obscure, for example, Tim, if you said, hey, I let the LLM do it and the LLM ended up writing it in, say PHP, I wouldn't be able to help you. Like, could I probably figure it out? Yeah, probably. But would I want to? Not really.
Yeah.
Because there's a reason I've never, used PHP. We choose our technologies based on our sort of affinity and just kind of how we like that technology and how they approach things. And then there's other technologies that, we're kind of like, oh, I don't like the way that looks. I don't like the way that works. I don't like type languages or dynamic languages. We all have our own preferences. But yeah, I think, having the more you do this, the more you'll start to learn maybe what frameworks are good. So if you can stick within that framework, but I wouldn't spend too much time with it in the beginning, especially if it's something pretty technical, because if it's technical, just you achieving it in whatever language is, I think that's great progress. And then you can build the technology around that thing as opposed to the other way around. I know you're working on a project now. What are you using to determine what's the next thing to work on your project?
Yeah, it's something that I continually kind of struggle with. What I've started to do, and I know this is going to be contrary to everything you just said, but I go to the LLM, I tell it my brain dump, everything creative and every crazy thing I think I want to do with it. I ask it to kind of, riff with me on it. That's what, me and Grok just riff back and forth. Grok is usually what I start with. And then what I'll do then is take kind of what it gives me and put that into deep research and tell it to look at each of like the components and to give me almost like structured sections of what those are, like what the components basically. Then I'll take those and I'll kind of just iterate a little bit more, make sure it's exactly what I'm looking for, and then I'll kind of look at it and be like, all right, what do I think is going to be the hardest thing to solve here? Which again, I know isn't perfect because sometimes I'll think something's super hard and it's relatively easy with the LLM, and then sometimes I'll think something's going to be super simple and it's the hardest part of the project. So I don't have a perfect way of kind of figuring out what my hardest thing is going to be, but I have figured out what I feel like is going to be the most important thing. And then I'll just start working on that. Start a new project and just start kind of going away on that. But I do like to get the framework of what it thinks I should do as far as my knowing my whole project, how it thinks I should build it. Should I build it in React? Should I build it JavaScript? Whatever. And that way I can tell the LLM, hey, we're going to build this component and it's going to be in this, particular either Next.js or, whatever. And then I feel more comfortable knowing that I'm building in what my larger project is going to end up being. And again, it's it's not a foolproof system or anything, but I've found that it's gotten me further and I've had better success of actually getting to parts where or getting where I want to be by the time I'm done with whatever component I'm working on. And again, I think it's just more of a peace of mind for me to be like, okay, I know that if I continue on this path, everything else that's been suggested and all the notes I've taken and everything should all work together, and I just need to keep building. And then I just take the next hardest thing or the next thing that I feel like is going to complement the thing I just did and work on that, and then just kind of keep going through the process.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the most important thing is the right thing to work on. The most important thing often tends to be the hardest thing, more often than not, because that's the thing that you're building that you think is innovative and unique and no one's ever done, and you have a strong opinion on. And so you're going to iterate on that thing until it meets the vision you had in your head. So even if it's just hey, I want to create a background remover, right? No big deal. But if you're really passionate about that thing, you might notice a pixel and you're like, that's unacceptable. And you'll keep going. So it becomes very hard to get from, 90% to 100%. And if that's the thing you're building, then that does become the hardest thing versus if it's someone else and that's just a side feature, that's not the hardest thing because they just get to the 90% and they're good, they're good with it. Right.
Yeah.
It's like, again, authentication. Most people it's just like, oh, log in with Google, log in, whatever. No big deal. Just use a provider. But if you're building the next clerk, then authentication and the user experience around it and the integrations becomes the most important thing. So it depends on, your specific project that determines one, what's most important. And then also if that important thing is also the hardest thing because of how much detail you're going to go into it. The other thing I will say is I think the LLMs would be great if you're trying to figure out your framework and you say, hey, these are my requirements in terms of I want people to access it on the web. I want people to, do it anonymously or to log in. I don't want to host it myself because I'm not technical, and if you give it that background, it'll probably provide good recommendations in terms of what technologies they use. Guillermo Rausch, who's the CEO of Vercel, recently said that, I forgot what percentage, but a decent amount of percentage, I think it's like 25%, somewhere around there, of their new signups were coming from the LLM traffic. So basically people asking, hey, what should I use? And then they're showing up. So the LLMs do a decent job, but it's also prone to, spammers now that they know LLM SEO is a thing and could be injecting somehow. It's not foolproof, but I think it does a reasonable job for sure. And then the last thing I'll say is think about what you're building. For a lot of people, they're literally building a wrapper around an LLM. And a lot of people have done well because they found a really interesting way to wrap an LLM in a novel way. So there's not a lot of functionality that goes around that, right? It's really just a UI over the LLM, but they just find that niche and they catch a spark of virality because they have distribution on Twitter or wherever. And those really, you don't need a lot of planning, right? Because they're really just wrappers around LLMs. You're not storing data. You're not building much. But in other cases, like what you're building, it's actually not even using AI, right? Yes, you have ambitions that one day it could use AI, but that's a very complex use case. And what you're trying to solve is a difficult problem so that it's hard for you to just vibe code it. It's going to run into all kinds of issues. And there's a lot of moving pieces. And every feature you add, the LLM ends up chewing more tokens and gets lost. And so it's a struggle for you because it is a bigger project. And that's why in your case, it does make sense to try to solve the individual components. So again, depending on how big of a vision. Now, if you explain to someone, say, "Hey, trying to build this," they'd be like, "Oh, that seems simple, right?" And again, sometimes things feel simple, but when you actually go into what's required to build what you're trying to build, it's not simple at all.
Yeah, I almost have a knack for picking like super ambitious projects. I don't know how to just pick something small and easy and get the win. I'm just like, let's do something crazy.
Yeah, and I think you were trying to choose something simple and
Yeah.
a quick win, the reality is it's a hard thing, which is why no one's done it well. And you got in there and you messaged me like, "Hey, I'm thinking about pivoting and doing all this stuff," and I'm like, "Whoa, your project scope was already this big, and now you want to triple it before you even solve the
Yep.
original problem." So I said, "Hey, why don't we just add this one piece to your scope? That way, it could be a bridge to when you do get to the vision." But otherwise, just try to keep the problem scope small, and then you can expand it as you reach those different milestones.
Yeah, and I think that's the cool part of kind of this new wave of, I guess we'll call ourselves developers, even though it doesn't feel like we should. Is that we'll have new ideas that maybe somebody that's gone to school for computer science and they've lived their life behind a desk may not have had those experiences that we've had. Now that the LLMs are here and they can help us along, I think there's going to be like a whole new wave of apps and tech and stuff like that that comes out in these other fields that really haven't been touched because nobody's experienced them to realize there's a need in that space. So I think that'll be cool to see as people get more involved and start doing this type of thing that don't necessarily have that background.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also, vibe coders have a huge advantage because they don't know what they don't know. So, like, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and build that, and they'll just persist through it until they get something that works. Whereas experienced developers might not even attempt that. But with the LLMs, there's just new possibilities. I have to remind myself to not close the door as often as I'm used to because we have to sometimes to not waste a ton of time chasing after features that are maybe not going to move the needle, but they're nice to haves, right? And you're like, yeah, that seems too difficult. It doesn't seem worth the effort. Whereas again, vibe coders, they don't have any sort of preconceived notions about how hard it's going to be and what the effort involved. And so they'll just give it a shot. And some of them will definitely get the perfect prompt that one shots them to a pretty cool feature or product.
I guess that's a good spot to wrap up. I think we've kind of covered the possibility of creep, kind of how to avoid it. Any final thoughts there, Johnny?
No, again, just, try to stay focused on solving that core problem. Obviously it can always be better, but try to get it to a useful state where you can use it, or you can get into some users to start playing with it and testing with it before you expand your vision. Because yes, the more we start building, the more our vision grows with that product. But we just have to make sure that we hit some milestones where we can release something, or get some people to use it. If you are constantly building to a grand vision and no one's using it, the opportunity for burnout is very high, or the potential that you just scrap the project because it just feels overwhelming at that point, and you've got a big project that now seems insurmountable, you're more likely to abandon it at that point. So I would say keep it small, get it out there, even if it's not fully featured, to at least see if it's got legs.
Well, and the cost too. I mean, if you're sitting there building this huge thing and it's costing you tokens and all of these different subscriptions, and it's taking you months and months and months, that can rack up quick. And just getting something out there and at least trying to monetize it in some way, even if it's small, can help with that and kind of help you keep moving that further. All right. Well, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. We're going to be doing some more tutorial type videos and kind of just expanding. We're just trying to add value to this community. So if you have any thoughts on something you'd like to see, feel free to drop it in the comments. And otherwise, we'll see you on the next one.